Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mike Connolly. I'm the supervising partner for the special education department at McAndrews, Mehalick, Connolly, Hulse and Ryan. And joining me today is my one of my partners, Heather Hulse, who runs our Scranton office. Today is a continuation of the series we've been doing regarding educational issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. And last week we talked a little bit about in-person instruction, and now we're going to talk a little bit about due process hearings and what that looks like during the pandemic. But we thought before we got into the due process hearings, we'd do just a little bit of a review and take a little step back and kind of talk about what the school district obligations are and to what extent they're any different under the pandemic and the closure. So kind of starting with that, the general question being, do school districts have an obligation to continue to provide FAPE during this period of time? Do they have evaluations? And the short answer to that they chose not to do that. So all of the requirements for FAPE are still in play, and whether the standard for FAPE in before the pandemic in March is the same standard for FAPE that we're dealing with today. I don't know, Heather, if there was anything you wanted to add specifically on that point.
I would just add that parents should be particularly cognizant and careful when they're signing documents to make sure that they're not waiving their right to a free, appropriate public education during periods of closure.
No, that's an important point. We've certainly heard where those kinds of waivers have been discussed or asked to be signed, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more during the presentation. In regard to districts' obligations for FAPE, the U.S. Department of Education and the Pennsylvania Department of Education have put out guidance on several occasions now. Starting with a March 12th guidance, initial guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, where they talked about a district's obligation to provide FAPE in the context of the pandemic. And they talked about if school districts are closing and not providing instruction to students, then there would be no obligation during that closure to provide FAPE to special education students. But if instruction was being provided, then FAPE was also a continuing obligation. And I think at that time, the pandemic was just having an impact on education. It was at the very beginning of this. And I think the thought process at the time was that we might do these very short, small school closures, contain the pandemic, and then we would be back to normal, which we all know hasn't occurred. So I think that initial guidance resulted in a bunch of school districts deciding, hey, we're just not going to provide services, and then we don't have to provide FAPE. So further guidance came out from the Department of Education, kind of changing that a bit and kind of pointing out that school districts should not be closing so as to avoid their obligation of FAPE. And Heather, I don't know if you saw that come up in the northeast part of the state at all, where schools were initially making that decision to close.
Initially, when COVID-19 first happened and the schools initially closed in March, initially we actually were seeing some local school districts in northeastern Pennsylvania advising that they were concerned about their ability to provide a free, appropriate public education, and were recommending that schools stay closed as a result. So it was certainly thankful from our perspective up here that the department did come out with that further guidance. Schools did open. We didn't have any issue with schools not opening even in the spring.
So the guidance from both the Pennsylvania Department of Education and U.S. Department of Education also address some of the issues regarding timelines. And all of those obligations are still there for timelines as far as completing IEPs, completing initial evaluations, and completing reevaluations. They're all still in place. Nothing has been waived. Although there have been some mixed guidance, I think, or some guidance that seemed to be a little bit in conflict with that, at least coming from the state, which seemed to suggest that while school districts had to comply with timelines, they didn't necessarily have to do in-person testing until schools reopened, and were doing in-person instruction. They also suggested that parents should and districts should cooperate in agreeing to extend timelines, which in theory is permitted under the regulations. We did get some newer guidance recently from the Department of Education that kind of softens, I think, a bit that original guidance, which now suggests that in-person testing can be done when safe to do so. We're in a very different situation now than we were several months ago, in that stay-at-home orders have generally been lifted. The school closure order has been lifted, and it's up to individual schools to decide how they're going to start the year. And in-person instruction is permitted as long as there is safety protocols put in place. So I think that changes the landscape a little bit on evaluations. But what are your thoughts, Heather?
Well, I agree, and I think it certainly changes it for the better. Initially, when schools closed in March, we had a lot of concerns and received many questions from clients and from other agencies about evaluations during COVID-19 and school closures. It seemed that many school districts and charter schools were taking the position that evaluations were somehow at a standstill until schools reopened. The United States Department of Education had made it clear at that time that timelines for evaluations had not been waived during COVID-19. But at that time, the Pennsylvania Department of Education was indicating face-to-face assessments could not happen until schools reopened. So there was, as you indicated, Mike, a little bit of disconnect. And I think school districts, again, interpreted as, okay, we don't need to evaluate. However, just recently, as you mentioned, the Pennsylvania Department of Education has clarified that face-to-face assessments can be completed so long as this can happen safely. Evaluations do happen in a one-on-one setting. I don't see much reason why they can't happen safely and in compliance with CDC recommendations. Social distancing can happen, disinfecting of the area, plexiglass, masks can be worn. So I think we certainly at this point have that guidance now that we can go ahead and safely conduct evaluations. I think a couple of things are also important to note that the Pennsylvania Department of Education has clarified. They have confirmed that the IDEA timelines for evaluating special education students have not been waived and were not waived at any time, and that it's not appropriate for a local educational agency to simply restart the timeline, the 60-day timeline during COVID-19. I had a couple of situations where school districts had tried to do this. They essentially sent letters to the families during the evaluation period after the school closure, had sent letters to the families saying that we're not able to complete the evaluation. We will reissue a permission to evaluate or permission to reevaluate when schools reopen, which was an indefinite time period. So we really didn't have anything happening. The other thing that I think was interesting to point out, that they weren't even attempting to complete the assessments that could have been completed, not in a face-to-face fashion. So for example, record reviews, rating scales, obtaining input from parents and teachers, those are all things that didn't have to happen face-to-face and certainly could have been completed during that time frame. I think lastly, school districts and charter schools, their failures to timely evaluate during COVID-19, I think would be considered violations of the IDEA and Section 504. And I do think the Pennsylvania Department of Education has supported that.
No, I definitely agree. And I think it's caused, not moving those evaluations forward, at least, in the past, with respect to the components that could be done without face-to-face. It has, not only does it hurt the child because you don't have, at least some level of additional data, records review, that kind of stuff, to make programmatic decisions now that you can always change when you can get more data. But I think it also probably, I've got to assume there's a backlog for school districts now with kids that needed to be evaluated, haven't been evaluated, and particularly where districts haven't even done record review or rating scales, things that could be done outside. Now they've got all that to do, plus evaluations. They've got more kids than they ordinarily would have to do it because of the backlog, and they still have 60 days to get it done. So I think in the long run, it's not only caused problems for families, but I think it's going to cause problems for school districts too, to try and get them done. I
agree. Very good point, Mike.
What about virtual testing? Heather, do you have any thoughts on doing any of the assessments virtual? Let's suppose a parent doesn't feel comfortable doing in-person testing in their area for whatever reason.
Well, the Pennsylvania Department of Education has offered some guidance in terms of their thoughts on virtual assessments as well. And basically what they say is that if the assessment itself can be administered, the validity would not be compromised, and it can be administered virtually, then so be it. Then that can happen virtually. So a lot of guidance that we've seen has been really a case-by-case and assessment-by-assessment analysis. So if a particular cognitive assessment, for example, or an academic achievement assessment, that assessment itself says this could happen in a virtual format, or if you have a certified school psychologist who has experience with that assessment and believes that it can be conducted in a virtual format without impacting or compromising the validity of the results, then that is okay to do those assessments virtually.
And I think it too would depend a little bit on the student and their ability to access the assessment virtually and access whatever rapport would need to be built with the evaluator over something like Zoom, as opposed to being in person.
Agreed.
Let's talk a little bit about due process hearings themselves and kind of what they look like in this world where we're not going into school buildings at the moment with so many schools deciding to go virtual. What's your experience been?
Sure. So moving into how would we proceed to a due process hearing during COVID-19. And I have to tell you, Mike, I was initially a bit nervous about the process. I'm very used to proceeding in person and feel very comfortable with that, and thought, oh goodness, we're going to have all sorts of problems with the technology. I don't know if I'm going to be able to see and hear the witness as well as I should be. Are we going to have an issue with getting exhibits and documents? So after having been through a virtual hearing, I can tell you that it is not at all what I had thought it was going to be, and it's actually it's not much different from being in the same room. I think in terms of preparation for the due process hearing, that requires a little bit more planning and preparation. So all of the exhibits during COVID-19 that parties want to introduce into the hearing will need to be uploaded to the special education hearing officer. So hearing officers will email a link to the counsel for the parents or pro se parent, counsel for the district, and then the exhibits can be uploaded into, mine happened via Dropbox. It was fairly simple. You would just scan the exhibits in and then upload them in. In terms of, so I myself prefer to have hard copies of exhibits. The council I was working with did as well. So we were able to coordinate and still use hard copies of exhibits for ourselves. And we also prepared hard copies of exhibits for the witnesses. So again, you know, I think if you are able to have a little bit more time to plan and get those exhibits together, it really isn't much different than doing it in person. Everyone had their binder, and the hearing officer, in my case, the hearing officer was viewing the exhibits virtually, but everyone else had their hard copies, and the hearing itself went relatively smoothly. It was all conducted completely virtually. The participants are all provided with a link by the hearing officer. So prior to the hearing session, you'll get a link so you can log into the hearing session. That might be via Zoom or some other program that's similar to Zoom. The participants in that session should certainly include the hearing officer, the court reporter, who will take down all of the testimony, counsel for the family, unless the parent is pro se, counsel for the local educational agency, the parent or guardian of the student, the local educational agency's representative, and then witnesses who are called to testify. And those witnesses could be called into the room individually. The due process hearing will proceed virtually in the same fashion that it would if you were proceeding in person. So witnesses are called to testify. Evidence is presented in the same fashion. Their cross-examination happens in the same fashion. The court reporter takes down everything. And like I said, in my experience, it really was very similar to being in person, except with the convenience of being able to do it virtually.
Yeah, and that's generally been my experience with the virtual hearing. I was also very hesitant at the beginning of this. The option of a virtual hearing is not really new in Pennsylvania. It's been something that hearing officers have been experimenting with for a while, mostly because they oftentimes find themselves traveling, I think, across the state to cover these due process hearings. With the limited number of hearing officers that we have. So that was a means to be able to, get hearings done more in a more timely fashion because you're removing the travel. But I was very hesitant to ever participate in that kind of hearing. I thought it was going to be a lot, just like you, a lot different and a lot less productive for my clients. So I was also, when we found ourselves in this situation where we really didn't have much but a choice to participate in this or let everything just sit, and I was kind of forced into it. I was pleasantly surprised as well. I mean, obviously you need to be somewhat flexible with the due process hearings. You will occasionally get technical glitches, or you've got storms going on and somebody's power goes out, or in the middle of testimony, or counsel can't sign on in the first place, and you'll get your occasional need to take a break for children, childcare issues, or pets coming across the screen. So there's some level of flexibility. that you got to give for these. But all in all, I agree with you, Heather. I think it's been much more similar to a hearing as if you were actually there than not. And I think it really has worked, and it's allowed the cases to move forward. But again, you can have those glitches, and again, depending on the hearing, it can seem to go a little bit slower, move a little slower than in person. But all in all, I agree. So in that context, though, what kind of issues are you bringing up at a due process hearing now as opposed to before? And I think certainly all of the kinds of issues that you may have brought up prior to COVID, you can still bring up. There's still valid issues for a due process hearing, and removing the COVID-19 issues for a moment, issues with the IEP, with the goals in the IEP, the supports in the IEP, progress over the past school years, those, and claims for compensatory education for past programming problems. Those are all still valid concerns. And then we've now got obviously a set of added issues when we look at current programming or programming going forward issues, the biggest one of which is, lots of schools are deciding to either go completely virtual for the start of the school year into the first marking period to the first half of the school year, and then reassessing. And others are doing, there are others that are doing the hybrid version where, students may be coming in 2 days a week and receiving virtual instruction 3 days a week. So that is really causing, and there are others too that I don't want to leave other school districts out there that are trying to go back full time. But for those doing a hybrid or all virtual, you're finding yourself in that situation of, well, what's programming for my child with special needs, with an IEP or a 504 plan, and how do we deal with that, because this virtual instruction isn't working and it's not going to be fake. And I think we're at a point now where that's a valid issue, and we're in a much different place than we were in March. I think we have a much better sense of the disease, of how it spreads, and how to prevent it. And I think we can put safety measures, in place, particularly where you've got schools that are going either a hybrid version or virtual. You're going to have empty school buildings, or significantly reduced populations in those school buildings, which should make social distancing easier. Special education classrooms are generally, roughly 10 students, give or take, in the classroom. So it's a smaller class to start with. Now you've got an emptier building. It's easier to spread the kids out for social distancing. You can use larger classrooms or rooms in the building, like the cafeteria, the gym, auditorium, if you really need to spread out. Face masks, except for, obviously there'll be some students that can't, but there's plexiglass dividers between the students. While the weather is workable, teaching outside, there's where transmission is, like, I think 20 times lower than indoors. So, and we talked quite a bit about that last week, but those are all valid ways to accommodate and allow special education students to come in at least 5 days a week to get that instruction when they're not. So I think that's a valid issue. Appropriateness of evaluations is a valid issue, whether the district's complying with those evaluations. So I think those are all still valid issues, and some of them with a bit of a new twist that can come up in due process hearings. What are your thoughts on some of the issues that you might see, Heather?
I agree with you, and I think parents need to understand, again, going back to that they are entitled, their child is entitled to a free, appropriate public education, and there are some students that a virtual format of instruction is not going to be appropriate. So for example, if you have a student that needs hand-over-hand assistance, that cannot happen in a virtual format. So I think those, you're going to see more of those types of issues if you have a school district that has gone completely virtual, for example, and says, well, we're not providing any face-to-face instruction, but for my special education student who needs it, that is still something that they are entitled to. So I think that's important to remember.
And that, that can also include instruction for related services. Now some related services may be a little bit easier to do virtually than others, but you still have to look at the individual child as to whether or not that is going to benefit, and they're going to really be able to access their related service, or do they need that related service to be provided, in person. Now, I think, some are a little bit more difficult. I don't know what your thoughts are on, the vocational work-based programs for transition, things of that nature, because I think that takes on a little bit of a different potential issues
Sure.
beyond what we've been talking about.
Well, sure. And first, in terms of related services, I think you're absolutely right that, some related services may be more challenging to do in a virtual setting than in person. So, for example, physical therapy, or occupational therapy, aspects of occupational therapy may need to happen in person. And again, we know now how we can do that. In school districts where they're completely virtual, hybrid, there's going to be their space to do that, and we can have that happen in a one-on-one situation where social distancing can happen, and disinfecting and masks, plexiglass, whatever needs to happen. But I think then there's other services that can happen virtually, and I want to get into first, though, the student themselves in terms of individualized. But so, for example, speech and language services could happen in a virtual format. I think that some aspects of occupational therapy can happen in a virtual format. Counseling services can happen in a virtual format. We saw during the whole pandemic when it first happened, counseling services and therapy was certainly considered an essential service. So those centers were still able to provide therapy, and they were able to offer teletherapy or video conferencing. So that's exactly the same thing that could happen from a related service perspective. So for students receiving counseling services, that service can happen virtually, can happen in the same fashion that it would happen in the mental health perspective. However, I think it's also important to point out, both in counseling services, speech and language services, and other related services, that even if the school district we've shut down, we're completely virtual, if it's not appropriate for my student for whatever reason, so let's say I have a student with speech and language needs who also has significant behavioral needs and would need to be in a face-to-face setting to have somebody be able to redirect them and keep them focused to the attention at task, then I think that the argument can be made that, look, my child needs this to happen in person. So there can be an argument for why those related services can happen in person as well. So before I move into vocation and work-based, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think it is a very individualized decision for students, because I think in theory, a lot of related services are set up in such a way that it can work, or at least certain aspects can work in the context of virtual sessions. I think, in that context, the related service of parent training, which is often forgot, comes into play, and that is, it's in the IDA. It's one of the related services a family is entitled to, and that's assistance or instruction to parents on how to address their child's needs and help with their child in the context of education. So a lot of times, I think in those related services where it is virtual, there's going to be some level of support that's going to have to happen on the other side from the parents. So I think parent training would come into play there to assist with that. On top of then looking at the individual needs, even with the parent there helping, is the child really going to be able to access that related service virtually, or do we need something, something in person.
I think that's a very good point, and parent training is often overlooked. I think it's the most underutilized related service.
Yeah, I could probably count on one hand. Maybe it would bleed into the second. Over 20 some years of doing this, that I've actually seen parent training listed in an IEP under related services.
Right. In terms of vocation and work-based programs, so, oftentimes those are happening either in the school has a vocational program in the building itself, or it might happen in some other remote setting where it's a work-based program. Remote learning might prove to be more challenging in these types of services and programming, particularly giving certain aspects of students' program may only be implemented in the vocational or work-based setting. So we might be learning some skills and things, but in terms of being able to implement the program itself, it's more of a hands-on. So to the extent that there is direct classroom-based instruction, again, to work on those skills, certainly that's something that I think could happen in a remote fashion. However, I don't think that you can, that you're going to be able to teach the entire vocational program remotely. Unless there's, I guess, a couple ideas. If it's appropriate and safe, and it's something that the students have access, could have access to the equipment or whatever it is they're working with at home, and they're watching and following along with an instructor virtually. That's one idea. Another idea is to coordinate with a vocational or work-based setting outside of the school district or charter schools. So, for example, if the student's in an automotive program, seeking out a local garage that would be willing to work with the student and coordinating with the district as, making that into a work-based vocational program that the student can receive credit for. Another idea is oftentimes these types of classes are smaller set of students. So we're not dealing with 30 students. We might be dealing with 10, 15 students. So perhaps, having a hybrid model, breaking it where some of the instruction happens virtually, we can work on those vocational skills. But then when the students need to come in and learn that hands-on aspect, perhaps splitting the classroom in two, in two groups, so that there could be a small group and socially distancing the students and come in and get that hands-on instruction. So those are some thoughts and ideas with vocation and work-based program. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that, Mike.
Your example of maybe being able to do certain things at home, the program that comes to my mind, most is something like a culinary arts program where everybody generally is going to have access to their kitchen at home if the parent feels comfortable letting them turn on the stove. I guess it all depends, but doing that kind of virtual scenario there could potentially work. Again, all of this comes back to an individual decision based on the individual child, and can this child access their program and obtain FAPE virtually. I think for some kids, there will be components of their program that maybe they can access and receive FAPE virtually. But there's going to be, I think, a fairly significant amount of special needs students where the virtual component, in most respects, just isn't going to work. So that brings me to what potential pitfalls or issues could come up that could hurt you in the context of a due process hearing, or in bringing up or raising these issues, whether directly to the school district or in the context of a hearing. And I think that brings us back to a discussion of really NORUPs and potential waivers. And I think on the NORUP side, you have to be careful if you're getting presented a NORUP for virtual instruction or some reduction in services due to COVID-19 or the way that they're going to handle school. I think you need to be careful to make sure that whatever is set up in that NORUP, it's clearly identified that it is temporary or through a particular time period. We're not just changing the placement, and at the end of that time period, it goes back to what the IEP previously was, assuming you're okay with whatever those changes are. And you want to make sure that there's nothing built into the NORUP, and there shouldn't be, but you want to make sure that says that you are, agreeing that this isn't FAPE and you're okay with that, or you're somehow waiving your right to FAPE during the period of any sort of virtual instruction. Now, since there currently is there's no school closure order, no stay-at-home order, so it would really be for any kind of virtual instruction going forward. I think that's really important to read your NORUPs closely. And, at this point, if you don't agree, it's okay to say, I don't agree. I don't think what you're proposing in this NORUP is FAPE. I disagree. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to go immediately to a due process hearing. You can, but it doesn't mean you have to. You can try and work with your school district. I think the first step is having a conversation with them to see what the district is willing and agreeing to do, different than what they propose, particularly when it comes to looking for in-person instruction versus virtual, to have that conversation with them first before taking the next step. Heather, your thoughts?
Well, so I agree with you on all of those points. I just would like to add that I think parents need to be very, very careful and just read everything that is put before them so they understand. And if they need to reach out to someone like us to ask questions, they should do so, because we have seen a lot of NORUPs that include a waiver of your right to a free appropriate public education during school closure, during COVID-19, and that is not something that you should be doing as a parent. So I think parents should be very careful about reading the documents line for line, understanding them, and before they sign them, to make sure they understand exactly what they're doing. I also think it's important for them to understand that they can agree to the implementation of whatever the district's offering, but not that it's appropriate. So they, just like you said, just write on the document, because this way the student continues to receive whatever it is they're offering. However, we don't think it's providing a free appropriate public education. And like you said, we can either try to work it out with the district. If we end up at a due process hearing, at least you have indicated that you did not agree that the district was offering what you think your child needs. So I think those are just things we need to be really careful about.
Yeah, agreed. And there's also, there's been times where issues have come up with respect to waivers directly related to COVID or contracting COVID again. My recommendation is not to, anytime a waiver is just given, not to sign a waiver, and at the very least talk to somebody before you make that decision to sign it, because you could be agreeing to something, giving up a right of your child that you're not even realizing you're giving up. So you want to make sure you understand what you're signing before you sign it. So I think overall the key thing to think about right now is that the obligation for FAPE is still there. It's still present. It's the same obligation that's always been there for FAPE. There's some new issues because of COVID-19, but it's the obligation for FAPE is still there. Hearings are still moving forward. You still have your rights as parents, and really to keep that in mind. Heather, do you have any final words?
I agree wholeheartedly. And if anyone needs answers to their questions, needs direction, we are here for you. Please feel free to give us a call, and we can help.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today, and hopefully this was some helpful information for you. Thanks.
Thank you.